once you have your running stitch exercise completed, it's time to sort of flex our muscles a little bit and see what we can do in terms of designing some three-dimensional templates and stitching them together. If this exercise is a little challenging to you, you felt like you didn't quite get it right, go ahead and practice it again. You can even practice following a curving stitch pattern, or for that matter, find some scrap fabric around the house and practice actually stitching something that's going to move quite a bit more. The paper is pretty rigid. It stays put when you're stitching. Fabric, you'll find, is really kind of fluid in its formation. It kind of falls in and out of position really easily. So there are a couple of things that we can do to help fix that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the real challenge for this project is coming up with some sort of template which, when you kind of cut it apart, cut it out of fabric and bend it and sew it together, that the end result is a three-dimensional form. And one way to do that would be to just sort of cut the stitching of a form that you already have and unfold it and reveal the template. But I want you guys to consider some of the forms that we already sort of know about and have practiced in our drawing classes so far this semester. A sphere, which is the example that I'm going to work up here, is a form, right, that is a little bit complicated to think about in terms of template. That's why I chose it. I kind of want to challenge myself, but I'm essentially going to be working up a sphere, and on the inside of that sphere, we'll be kind of using some fluff, right? And so in some ways it's a very complicated template, but it's a very basic form in that it's only two pieces to the template. But consider, if you don't want to attempt a sphere, consider some of the other shapes or forms that we're comfortable with, right? Let's just say, for example, you really were into the idea of making a soft cylinder. Now, break that soft cylinder into its component parts, and we've got a circle on the top, some sort of rectangle on the bottom. I want you to imagine, right, that as your cylinder wraps around, that it's going to require a seam here, and a bottom. And then in terms of sort of coming up with the dimensions of this template, your circle circumference is going to be directly corresponding to the length of your rectangle. So just kind of like imagine, right, that I've got a 3-inch diameter circle. That measurement goes all the way around the circle, the same way that this measurement is going to travel end to end on the rectangle. There's also the kind of possibility, right, that instead of using only sort of soft polyfill on the inside, you could add a certain amount of weight to your object by changing up the fill. Let's just say, for example, we are working with cone form, and instead of just fill, like just a polyfill on the inside, you really wanted to kind of give it like a hard bottom, or like to give it something to set hard on the bottom here. Well, you could fill the bottom with something heavy. Like certain toys, for example, would use something really basic, like raid the pantry and get some dried beans or lentils, and you would sew a pocket for the lentils inside of your form so that it would be soft on top, and then it would have sort of a punk, kind of, it would sit heavy on the ground. This is a way that you could maybe like step up the challenge of this project, is to start thinking about more complicated forms and more complicated fills. If something like a cone is something you're really interested in, let me know and I'll forward you an email with cone generating software so that you can actually print out the template. A cone has somewhat of a complicated form to just sort of figure out on your own. But the actual kind of printout of a cone, it can be sort of a complicated thing to figure out. You can just sort of trial and error it over and over and over again, but oh man, it's just really challenging, especially for something like a truncated cone. Say you really wanted your cone, instead of coming to a point, if you wanted that cone to sort of be split and have a circular top instead of a pointed top, the software is actually a really handy way to sort of generate that truncated cone and print out the solid template. The first form I'm going to challenge you with will be a sphere, and I want you to think about baseball, right? Because there are a couple different ways that we could cut two-dimensional templates in order to arrive at a sphere, and the one that I think is the most exciting are these two overlapping sort of dog bone figure 8 shapes that are used to generate a spherical baseball. Now this stitch is kind of a unique stitch to the leather that the baseball is made out of. You can call it a baseball stitch or steering wheel stitch, but it uses two needles that sort of interlock. We're not going to do that. We're going to use just our straight running stitch in order to pull this off. But what we essentially need to do is we need to get this template. The template used to make a baseball is this sort of dog bone shape, and two of them sort of hold on to each other in sort of a cup form. And I suppose if I didn't love this old baseball, I'd just cut the stitching, lay it flat, and get my template design that way. But instead, I did a little bit of trial and erroring, and I figured out some measurements, and I think that I pretty much got it down. This template is wrong. It's the one I used to design this ball, and it got a little bit oblong, and so I've got another one here in Illustrator that we'll use. Essentially, the dimensions of our template in Illustrator look something like this. We're going to use two 3-inch circles that have a waist of about 1 1/4 inch, and the overall length of this dog bone is 9 inches. A couple things. That makes it easily printable on an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper, and it'll end up resulting in a sphere that's slightly larger than a baseball or so. So how do we do this in Illustrator? Well, let's just kind of run this Illustrator demo right back to the beginning, go File, New, and since we're going to be designing in inches and printing to a standard printer with 8.5 by 11 inch paper, when you're setting up your document, make sure that you're working with 8.5 by 11 inches over here in the units, and create that document. Now, in your new document, go ahead and start by using the circle tool. Keyboard shortcut for that is L. Now, the circle tool is the ellipse tool, and if I just start drawing with that ellipse tool, I'll end up with all kinds of oblong shapes. If I start drawing with Shift held down, my circles stay perfectly round. And you'll notice that because I have my smart guides turned on, I have a little height width gray box that's kind of dynamically showing me the dimensions of that. And I could try to really carefully kind of hit that right on the button 3-inch circle, but there's an even easier way. As long as I have my circle tool selected, keyboard shortcut L, click once in the frame, and I'm just going to tell Illustrator what the size of my circles need to be. If I set my circle to 3 by 3 inches, essentially that makes a 3-inch by 3-inch diameter circle. It's going to be a perfectly round circle with a 3-inch diameter. Now I'm going to copy this circle and sort of pull it straight out to the side. To do that, I'm going to use my Move tool, keyboard shortcut V, hold Option, and just sort of pull that circle over. Now, if I hold Shift simultaneously as I'm kind of copying that over, no matter how crazy I get with my mouse, it still kind of bumps straight across. Now, what I need to do is get these circles 9 inches apart at their outer edges, and I need a waist of about 1 1/4 inch. If I use M, keyboard shortcut M, the rectangle tool, and click once, I can set my rectangle here to be 9 inches by 1 1/4 inches. Click OK, and now I'll use this rectangle as a bit of a guide in order to orient my two circles. Now, if you don't have smart guides turned on, if you don't see all these kind of pink lines that are helping you align everything, go to View, Smart Guides, or Command U on a Mac. Now, if you want to kind of use another built-in alignment tool, a handy way to sort of align these things would be to select the rectangle and the circle, both at the same time, and come over to your Align palette and click Horizontal Left Align. Now, if I don't have my Align palette open, I'll go to Window, Align, Shift F7. If I do that for both circles, and if I bump one all the way to the right, one all the way to the left, and then I can actually align these center as well, so that they're all kind of running perfectly on an even horizontal plane. It's not a bad idea. Now I'm going to come in a little bit more closely, and I'm going to use the arrow keys to sort of tap my circles into alignment. What I'm looking for here is the edge of my circle and the edge of my rectangle to be more or less kind of kissing right at that 9-inch mark, way on the outside. Now, since we're designing in a computer, the tendency is going to be to want to be absolutely perfect with all this, but remember, we're going to be working with fabric, and fabric is all about seams, and it's flexible, and it's kind of manipulating, so this is not like micrometer precision. This is, fabrics, woven materials are going to be dynamic, they move, your stitch lines may not be perfect, so be as accurate as you can here in the computer, but keep in mind that the computer is kind of going to give us a false sense of like precision here. We don't need to make this thing so precise. Now, here's the trickiest part about this design. I need to kind of belly out this dog bone, and I don't just want to wing it. I don't just want to draw that in. I want to see if I can use maybe the radius of a circle to fill that in. And I'm going to come back to the circle tool, keyboard shortcut L. I'll hold Shift and draw out a nice big circle. And if I want to kind of move that circle around as I'm drawing it and kind of keep it live, keep it dynamic, I've got to hold a couple of keyboard shortcuts down. So let me try this again. If I hold Shift, my circle stays perfectly round. If I simultaneously hold down the space bar, I can move that circle into position. If I let go of spacebar, I can stretch it up again, grab spacebar, and move it around. What I'm looking to do is sort of have this circle touch all three surfaces. Touch the circle on the left, touch the circle on the right, and just barely touch the rectangle in the middle. So the circle has to be just the right diameter in order to do that. Now, we're going to use a keyboard shortcut. We're going to use a palette here in a second that's going to require each one of these circles, each one of these shapes to slightly overlap. Now you see how the overlap here on the rectangle is a lot and almost none over here in the circles. It's going to have to overlap just a tiny amount in all three places, and I want to overlap it about equivalent. I want to make sure that the overlaps are about the same in all three spots. So as you're working on drawing this circle, try to get it to be just the right size so that it touches each three of those areas and overlaps at about the same amount in each one of them, just slightly kissing over the line. Now I want to copy that circle right up on top so that this sort of waist is mirrored on the top and the bottom. I don't think I'm going to have quite enough room up there, so I need to move this whole design down just a little bit. And then I'll copy the circle straight up, holding Option and holding Shift so that it stays in a perfect alignment top to bottom. Then I'll come in a little bit closer, Command plus, zoom in, and tap that circle into a slight overlap. Now, with those slight overlaps, I'm able to use a tool that's really, really handy. Essentially, I want to get rid of some of this extra content here. I could probably just print this and just sort of keep in mind, where my cut lines are, but I want to end up with just the dog bone template to print. So I'm going to select each one of these shapes that I've drawn, come over to my toolbar, and grab the Shape Builder tool, Shift M. You notice that when I'm hovering over shapes that I've selected, the Shape Builder sort of grays out certain areas of the design. What I want to do is I sort of want to merge shapes now. So I'm going to merge these shapes together by clicking and drawing a line over those transitions. Anywhere that I have two overlapping shapes, I can crisscross over one of those lines, and it allows it to sort of fill in or draw in where it's supposed to be. Now I don't need all of these shapes. In fact, I want to delete away some of this extra content. And so I'll switch over to my Move tool, keyboard shortcut V, and I'll just remove any of the little bits that are left over that don't belong. Now I have these slight little kiss marks up here in the corners, and I could do a couple things. Those are probably disconnected from my design, but you notice that if I move it away, it looks a little bit harsh at these corners, like it's been clipped or cut. I think instead I'll grab my entire design here. I'm going to my Pathfinder palette. The Pathfinder palette is hiding underneath Window. Come all the way down to Pathfinder. Shift Command F9 is the keyboard shortcut for that. And Unite. The upper left-hand option here, Unite, will just sort of snap each one of those into position. Now, I'm going to probably end up having to correct for some of this slightly wonky, not perfect smoothness, but that's a pretty good template to bring to the printer. As long as I don't shrink or expand that template at all when I go to print, it should have those exact dimensions. I'm going to rotate this into position, and I only really need one printed template because I'll copy it twice onto the fabric. I'm going to go ahead and click this thing, click print, make sure that it's fit perfectly onto the document window here so that it's not clipping any of the edges off. I'm going to click do not scale, that way I know that my dimensions are perfect. I'll have a 9-inch wide by 1 1/4 inch and 3-inch circles on either end. Send that to the printer, and then I'll go back to the studio to trim this template. But the template that I designed in Illustrator is sort of the result of a bit of trial and erroring. The first template that I used to design my sort of preliminary test piece, I felt like it had a little too much thickness in the diameter here, maybe not enough length, maybe the circles weren't quite right, and so I've reprinted my template. And this is just a standard thickness printer paper. It should be good enough, but if you have the opportunity to print on something a little bit thicker, a thicker template is easier because eventually we're going to be running a pencil along the edge of the template and transferring this measurement to the fabric. And a really thin piece of paper can get a little bit tricky to do that. In this case, I don't have any thicker paper, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut this right out. So now I've got my updated template. I probably should mark the two so that I know which one is which. If I kind of lose track of which templates are which, that's going to be no good. call that number 2. That way I'm kind of incrementally improving my design as I go. So at this point, I want to kind of step over to my fabric, and I haven't given you guys tons and tons of this fabric, and so if you happen to have any scrap material laying around, any old rag would do for this kind of exercise, especially if you want to do some practicing. The fabric that I've given you is 100% cotton. It's sort of a nice tight weave. It should be really nice for practicing the projects, but it's not the most exciting color, and same with the thread, right? It's not the most exciting thread color in the world. If you happen to have some of your own materials around, you're welcome to use that as well. I've pre-ironed my material so that it doesn't have any hard creases or crinkles in it. When I use an iron, I set the temperature nice and high for 100% cotton material, and I just give it 1 or 2 light passes with some steam. That should knock down all of the wrinkles for you so that your project is a little bit easier to keep track of. If you'd like to do a little bit of practice stitching, it's probably not the worst idea to grab a piece of scrap material and practice a running stitch or two, just to kind of get the feel of the way that stitching works with fabric instead of paper. Now, when you're working with this sort of scrap and trying to keep track of the material, if you, especially this softer cotton, right? It's so fluid. It just kind of falls in and out of its form really easily. It can be kind of a pain to kind of keep that fabric steady as I'm trying to hand stitch. So enter your 5 pins that we've got on the inside here. Now, if I know that I'm trying to sew a seam along the top of this fabric, I might lay it down on my workspace and, carefully get everything aligned just the way I want it, and as soon as I pick it up, it falls apart. This is where these 5 pins can come in really handy. I'll use these pins as temporary stitches to hold my seam in place. This is a really handy tool for especially being able to lay up templates and work with fabric dynamically. If I was kind of modeling it on a person, say if I was designing a hat or an article of clothing, pinning fabric together is sort of a temporary seam. If I was going to sew another short seam along the top here, I might use 3 pins to hold this in place, and I would run those pins right along where my seam would be. Those pins hold my seam in place. I could run my stitches through and then pull out the pins when I was all done. And that's a really handy way to kind of hold your template in position as you're working. As I'm working on my sphere, I may or may not use some of these templates. I may just use my fingers as a little clamp, make 2 stitches, move the clamp, make 2 stitches. You'll see why here in a second. So I'm going to lay out my fabric and begin by cutting my templates. I'm going to make sure that I sort of space my templates out carefully on the fabric. Inevitably, there's going to be some waste here as I cut, and so I'll probably scoot my template as close to the edges of my fabric as I can. This way I have some extra fabric in case I goof, and I'm also not just wasting fabric arbitrarily. So I'm going to make my first cut here, up here toward the corner. Since this fabric is really light, I should just be able to use a nice soft pencil to mark the edges. I don't want my pencil lines to be real heavy. All I really need is to be able to follow them carefully with the scissors at some point. Now, a tailor, which is what you call somebody who works on clothing items, or a seamstress, might not even use graphite. They might use chalk. Now, the biggest reason that they would use chalk to mark their lines is that chalk easily erases and washes out of the material. This is especially important if you're working with nice expensive materials. You don't want to mess it up with graphite, which doesn't always come out of materials, especially white materials. So I've got my first dog bone drawn in. Now I'm going to offset my second dog bone and put it reasonably close to my first one. That way I'm not wasting a lot of extra material out here. Then I've got my 2 dog bones worked out here. I'm going to carefully cut along their edges with the scissors. I noticed that I use a scissors for these kind of cuts, template cuts on fabric instead of my razor blade. Now, depending on the design that you're working with, it's possible that you might be able to use a razor blade to cut through the fabric, but in my experience, it just sort of snags the edges, and instead of cutting a nice straight line. So unless you have a really sharp blade and you're doing a lot of straight line cuts, I'd avoid the razor blade. If you happen to have a rotary cutter, which is not a straight blade but actually a circular disc that rolls over the fabric, that's a much nicer tool for cutting material than these straight razor blades. Otherwise, find yourself a nice set of scissors and go ahead and cut out your templates.